The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m. in a dull red light that made the ceiling look stained with shadows. My throat felt dry and bitter, as if I had swallowed ash. I reached across the bed for the familiar warmth of my husband David, but my hand touched only cold sheets and empty space. Where did he go? I whispered to myself. David had been restless lately, always pacing, always checking his phone, always complaining about pressure at his construction company. I told myself he was just stressed, but something in my chest felt tight and wrong. I picked up my phone to open the living room security feed. Since we adopted our British short-hair cat, I had gotten used to checking cameras when I heard noises at night. My fingers slid across the screen, but instead of the living room, I accidentally opened the dash cam app for my new SUV. The screen lit up and showed our garage bathed in yellow light. And that is when my blood turned to ice. David was lying on his back under my car wearing gray sweats and rubber gloves. A small flashlight was clenched between his teeth. In his hand, he held a pair of steel wire cutters. He was not fumbling. He was precise. Every time the cutters closed, another brake line snapped. I covered my mouth to stop a scream. Tears burned down my face, but my heart felt frozen. The man who kissed me goodnight was destroying the one thing that kept me alive on the road. Then his phone rang. He took the flashlight from his mouth and answered on speaker, laying the phone on the concrete floor so he could keep working. A woman spoke. Her voice was sweet but sharp. "Honey, are you almost done? Our son is kicking again and I am so tired. That $5 million has to belong to him. Do not forget to clean everything when you finish." David laughed softly. "Do not worry, Lena. I am cutting the brake lines right now. Tomorrow Julia will be driving through the mountains. One sharp turn and it will all be over. Once she's gone, the money will be mine, and you and our boy will live in this house." The phone slipped from my hand onto the bed. $5 million. A son. A plan. The man I married was planning my death. I pulled the blanket over my face as my body shook. I bit my lip until I tasted blood just to keep myself quiet. That night, the woman who trusted her husband died, and someone else took her place. My name is Julia Reynolds, and until that night, I thought I had a normal marriage. I worked as a financial analyst in Richmond. My life was quiet, organized, and built on numbers and planning. David used to say he admired that about me. He said I was steady, reliable, the kind of woman a man could build a future with. 3 weeks earlier, that future changed. I received a call from a lawyer in Zurich telling me that my Aunt Helen had passed away. She had never married and never had children. I was the only family she had left. She left me $5 million. $5 million. When I told David, he hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. He said this was our miracle, our new beginning. But after that day, I noticed something different in his eyes. It was not happiness. It was calculation. David owned a small construction company in Virginia. On the surface, it looked successful, but behind closed doors, it was drowning in debt. He had borrowed from private lenders. He had taken risks he could not cover. He never told me how bad it was until the inheritance arrived. Suddenly, he talked about joint accounts, about moving my money into his company, about how everything in a marriage should be shared. I told him I wanted to talk to my parents first. I wanted to invest carefully. That money was my safety, my future, the legacy of a woman who had loved me like a daughter. David smiled when I said that, but his smile did not reach his eyes. That is why I bought the new SUV. I planned to drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains to visit my parents and discuss how to protect the inheritance. It was supposed to be a safe trip, a simple road through green hills and quiet towns. I never imagined my husband was turning that car into a weapon. $5 million did not just change our bank account. It changed the man sleeping beside me. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling long after the dash cam feed went black. My body wanted to scream. My hands wanted to shake David awake and demand answers. But something deeper inside me went cold and clear. If I screamed, I would be dead. So I stayed silent. I carefully saved the video from the dash cam. Then I sent a copy to a secret email account I had created years earlier when I worked with fraud cases. I also copied it onto a small USB drive and hid it inside the lining of my makeup bag. Only then did I let myself breathe. I did not cry like a broken wife. I cried like someone who had just survived an ambush. I kept thinking about Lena and the child she mentioned, about the way David laughed when he said my life would end on a mountain road, about how easy it was for him to plan my death. In that moment, I understood something that every woman should know. Danger does not always come with raised voices. Sometimes it comes with kisses and coffee in the morning. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I stood up and went to the bathroom. I looked at my reflection. My face looked pale, but my eyes were different. They were awake. Tonight, the naive wife died. The woman in the mirror was someone else, someone who would survive, someone who would make sure the truth came out. When David came back into the bedroom an hour later, he slid under the covers like nothing had happened. He wrapped an arm around me and kissed my hair. "Sleep well," he whispered. I lay still, pretending to breathe slowly. In my mind, I was already planning my escape and his downfall. The morning sun filled our kitchen with a warm, golden light that felt cruelly out of place. Coffee steamed on the counter, fresh bagels sat on a plate. From the outside, our home looked peaceful. From the inside, it felt like a trap. David sat at the table reading the business section of the paper. When he saw me, he smiled and pulled out a chair. "Good morning, sweetheart. I got your favorite bagels. You should eat before you drive. The mountain roads are long and steep." I poured myself coffee and forced my hands not to shake. "You are always so thoughtful," I said. "Did you check the car properly yesterday? I just feel a little nervous about driving that far." For a fraction of a second, his eyes shifted away. Then he smiled again. "Of course I did. It is a brand new SUV. I even took it to the dealership. Everything is perfect. You have nothing to worry about. Nothing." The word made my stomach twist. I nodded and sat down across from him. I watched the man who had promised to protect me lie to my face as easily as he sipped his coffee. "You will be careful up there," he said softly. "Those curves can be dangerous." I wanted to laugh. He was not worried about curves. He was worried about me surviving them. I buttered a bagel slowly and took a bite. Every swallow felt heavy in my throat. I had never been so close to someone who wanted me dead. The doorbell rang suddenly, cutting through the tension. David looked relieved. "Saved by the bell," he said with a light chuckle. But I knew better. Something was coming, something that would decide who lived and who did not. The front door swung open, and Brooke Reynolds walked in like she owned the place. Her long blonde hair was messy, and her phone was already in her hand. Behind her was her boyfriend, a rough-looking man named Kyle, who smelled of cigarette smoke and trouble. Brooke did not even say hello. "Julia, we are taking your new SUV today," she said. "My car is in the shop, and Kyle promised his friends a mountain trip. We cannot show up in something old and embarrassing." Before I could answer, Margaret Reynolds came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Oh, let her take it, Julia," she said. "You are rich now. A car sitting in the garage will just go bad. Let Brooke enjoy it." David froze. I saw sweat form at his hairline. He knew that car was no longer just a car. It was a coffin on wheels. But he could not stop them. If he did, he would have to explain why. I pretended to hesitate. "But I was going to drive that car to see my parents today," I said. "It was just serviced." "I am not sure it is ready for a long trip yet." Brooke slammed her hand on the table. "Do not be cheap, Julia. Just because you got some inheritance, you think you are better than us now." Margaret turned on me. "Why are you being so difficult? She is your sister-in-law. Let her use the car." All eyes turned to David. "Say something," Margaret snapped. "Are you afraid of your wife?" David swallowed. For a moment I thought he might stop it, but pride won. He sighed and looked at me. "Just let her take it, Julia. It is just a car. Just a car." I slowly reached into my purse and took out the keys. I placed them on the marble counter. The sound of metal against stone was sharp and final. "Fine," I said quietly. "Just be careful, Brooke. That car has a lot of power." Brooke grabbed the keys with a grin. "Now that is more like it," she said. David reached out too late. Brooke and Kyle were already heading for the door. I watched them go, knowing exactly what those keys meant. They did not unlock a luxury vehicle. They unlocked the gates of hell. The roar of the SUV faded down the driveway and left behind a silence that felt thick and heavy. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every breath sound too loud. I sat on the sofa and picked up an apple from the bowl on the table. Slowly, I began to peel it in one long, thin strip. My hands were steady, even though my heart was not. David could not sit still. He paced from the window to the door and back again. He checked his phone, then the clock, then his phone again. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. "You look nervous," I said softly. "Brooke is a good driver. That car is full of safety features." He jumped. "I am just worried," he said quickly. "Those mountain roads are dangerous and she likes to speed." I watched him closely. He was not afraid for his sister. He was afraid the brakes would not fail when he needed them to. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Each second felt like a slow drumbeat. 1 hour passed, then 2. The house felt like a waiting room for something terrible. David picked up his phone and put it down again, over and over. His hands shook. He was waiting for a call. And so was I. The phone finally rang. The sound was so loud in the quiet room that David flinched like he had been struck. He stared at the screen for a moment. An unknown number. His hand trembled as he answered. "Hello," he said. I watched his face as he listened. The color drained from his skin. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then the phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor. "No, no," he whispered. "That cannot be right." He collapsed to his knees as if his bones had suddenly turned to water. Tears poured down his face. Margaret rushed in from the hallway. "David, what happened?" she cried. He could not speak. I leaned down and picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "State Highway Patrol, Mom. There has been a serious accident involving a white SUV registered to your household. The vehicle experienced total brake failure while descending a mountain road. It went off the side of a ravine. The 2 people inside did not survive." Margaret screamed and fainted. David made a broken animal sound. I knelt beside him and whispered so only he could hear. "Was it supposed to be me, David?" His eyes snapped up to mine. In them I saw terror, like I had never seen before. "You know," he whispered. I stood up slowly. The truth was out. The plan had worked, just not the way he wanted. The county morgue was cold in a way that made my bones ache. The smell of disinfectant burned my nose as 2 metal tables stood under harsh white lights. White sheets covered what remained of Brooke and her boyfriend. David stood beside me, shaking so badly he could barely stay upright. His eyes were wide and hollow, as if he were looking into a nightmare he could not wake from. The medical examiner pulled back the first sheet. The body was burned and broken, but a small gold necklace with a clover charm still rested against blackened skin. "That is Brooke," David whispered. "I gave her that necklace last year." He fell to his knees and sobbed. I did not move. The examiner nodded and reached for a bag of personal items recovered from the wreck. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside was a scorched designer purse, melted makeup, a cracked phone, and a folded piece of paper. The examiner handed it to Margaret, who had just been helped into the room. It was an ultrasound image. 8 weeks. Pregnant. Margaret stared at the picture and let out a scream so raw it cut through the air. "My baby? My grandchild?" She collapsed to the floor. David looked like he was going to vomit. 2 lives gone, because he wanted money and a son. I stood there feeling nothing but a cold, heavy calm. This was only the beginning. The police station smelled of old coffee and paper. David sat beside me at a metal table, his hands shaking in his lap. A senior investigator leaned forward with a calm but sharp gaze. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, "why was your sister-in-law driving your vehicle this morning?" I swallowed and spoke softly. "Brooke came to our house and demanded to borrow the SUV. I did not want to give it to her. I planned to use it myself. But David said I was being selfish. He insisted I give her the keys." The investigator turned to David. "Is that true?" David nodded weakly. "Yes," I continued. "A few days ago, I heard a strange clicking sound from under the car when I parked it in the garage. I wanted David to check it, but he said it was nothing. This morning I tried to mention it, but everything happened so fast," David snapped. "That is not true. You imagined it." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Reynolds, why are you so upset?" David wiped sweat from his face. "Because she is confusing things. The car was new. There was nothing wrong with it." I looked down at my hands. I just wish I had insisted. If I had, maybe Brooke would still be alive. The investigator made notes. David did not realize it yet, but the trap was closing around him. That night, I sat alone in the guest room and finally allowed myself to breathe. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I called my father. "Dad," I said, my voice breaking. "David tried to kill me." There was a long silence. Then his voice turned hard. "I am coming." "Not yet," I said. "I need you to do something smarter. Call Mr. Adams, our family lawyer. I want every joint account frozen immediately." After I hung up, I called Mr. Adams myself. I explained everything in a low, steady voice. Within an hour, emergency papers were filed. David could not move a single dollar without being flagged. Then I checked the dashcam files again. 3 copies, One on the USB, one in my email, one in the cloud. Insurance. That video was my shield, and his end. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since 3 a.m, I felt something close to control. Brooke funeral was held 3 days later in a quiet white chapel outside of town. The air smelled of flowers and incense, and grief hung over the room like heavy fog. People whispered as they walked past the casket. A young woman dead in a new luxury car always made people curious. David stood beside me in a black suit, his face pale and tight. His eyes kept scanning the room as if he expected someone to shout the truth. Then the doors burst open. Margaret staggered inside, supported by 2 relatives. Her hair was loose, her face streaked with tears. "My daughter," she cried. "My baby." She rushed toward the casket and began beating the wood with her fists. Someone killed her. A new car does not just fail. The room fell silent. I stepped forward. "Mom, please, she needs peace." Margaret turned on me. "You!" she screamed. "You gave her that car. You knew something was wrong. You wanted her dead." Before I could react, her hand struck my face. The sound echoed through the chapel. I fell to the floor in shock. David froze. I looked up at him, tears streaming. "David, tell her the truth. You told me to give Brooke the keys." All eyes turned to him. He grabbed his mother roughly. "Stop it," he hissed. "You are making a scene." His fear was louder than his grief. People began to whisper. The perfect brother was cracking. While everyone was distracted by the chaos in the chapel, I stepped quietly into a side hallway. I took out a second phone I had prepared days earlier and opened a photo. It was an ultrasound. The name at the bottom read, Lena Parker, 12 weeks. A boy. I typed a short message and sent it to Margaret's phone. "This is the child your son wanted. This is why Brooke died. $5 million for a firstborn son." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to my seat as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, Margaret's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen. At first, her face was confused. Then it went blank. Her hand began to shake. The color drained from her cheeks. She looked up at David, not with grief, with horror. Everything she believed about her son collapsed in that moment. The son she worshipped had traded his sister for money and another woman child. Margaret did not scream. She did not cry. She just stared. Sometimes silence is louder than any accusation. That evening, David came home like a storm. His tie was loose. His eyes were red. He slammed the door so hard the walls shook. "Why are all my accounts frozen?" he shouted. "What did you do?" I sat on the couch, pretending to be afraid. "I do not know what you are talking about," I said. "Maybe the police did it because of the accident." He grabbed the edge of the table. "You think I am stupid?" "The bank said it was because of a marital dispute." "You did this." Margaret came down the stairs, slowly holding her phone. "David?" she said quietly. "Who is Lena?" He froze. "I told you to mind your own business," he snapped. She held up the ultrasound. "Who is this child?" David's face went white. "You have no right to that," he said. Margaret walked closer. "You killed my daughter. For this, David lost control. It was supposed to be Julia," he shouted. "Not Brooke. She was not meant to be in that car." The room went silent. I reached behind the vase and pressed a button on my phone. Recording. Margaret stumbled back. "What did you say?" David covered his mouth. Too late. He ran upstairs and slammed the door. The truth had finally come out. The next morning, the police arrived with calm, serious faces. David sat at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee like it held answers. Margaret had not slept. Her eyes were swollen and empty. An investigator placed a small black USB drive on the table. "Mrs. Reynolds, you mentioned hearing something under the car before the accident. We would like to see any recordings you may have." I nodded and handed them the USB. The screen came to life. There was David in the garage at 3 a.m. Gray sweats, rubber gloves, steel cutters. The sound of metal snapping filled the room. Then Lena's voice played through the speakers, talking about their son and the $5 million. Margaret covered her mouth. David stood up so fast his chair fell over. "Turn that off," he shouted. The investigator did not. David's voice came through the recording, calm and cold. "Once Julia is gone, the money will be mine." Margaret collapsed. David dropped to his knees. It was over. There was nowhere left to hide. The trial moved quickly once the evidence was public. There was nothing David's lawyer could say to explain a video of him cutting brake lines or a recording of him planning my death. He stood in court thin and broken as the judge read the verdict. 20 years. No parole for a long time. I did not feel happy. I felt finished. The divorce was granted the same week. Every account was reviewed, every asset traced. Most of what David had once called ours was returned to me. The $5 million from my aunt was finally safe. I sold the house. Too many memories. I kept only my clothes, a few books, and my cat. Sometimes letting go is the strongest form of revenge. I walked away without looking back. 3 years passed like a long, quiet breath after a storm. I moved into a small apartment in the city with big windows and soft light. It was not as large as the old house, but it felt safe, and that mattered more than anything. I went back to work and slowly rebuilt my confidence. Numbers made sense again. So did mornings and evenings and weekends that belonged only to me. I invested part of my inheritance into a chain of organic food stores. It started with one small shop and grew from there. I learned how to trust my judgment again. I learned how to listen to that quiet inner voice that had tried to warn me before everything fell apart. Sometimes memories still visited me, not as nightmares, but as faded scenes from a film I once watched. David voice, the garage, the sound of metal snapping. They no longer controlled me. One afternoon, I found a yellow envelope in my mailbox. The return address was a correctional facility. His name was on it. I did not open it. I fed it into my paper shredder and watched it turn into thin white strips. Whatever he wanted to say could stay with him. My life was no longer tied to his. I stood by my window that evening, watching the city lights come on one by one, and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Peace. If there is one thing this story should leave you with, it is this. Your intuition is not fear, it is information. Julia did not survive because she was stronger than everyone else. She survived because she listened to the quiet warning in her chest and chose to act instead of panic. Most betrayals do not start with shouting. They start with small lies, with financial pressure, with someone slowly treating you like a resource instead of a person. If someone suddenly becomes obsessed with your money, your control, or your future, pay attention. Protect yourself. Document everything. And never ignore the feeling that tells you something is wrong. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps this channel reach more people who may need to hear these stories. Share it with someone you care about. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from and whether you have ever trusted your intuition and been proven right. This is the art of revenge. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply surviving and taking your life back.